The next series we're going to discuss is the conbraco 4W500 series, which is a spill-resistant pressure vacuum breaker, also known as the SVB4W series, produced in sizes 1/4 through 1/2 inch. Had an integral bill valve built into the body. The smaller sizes of the body had a plastic construction of a glass-filled rail and canopy on the top. It was a SVB, but it was unique in that it was a horizontal configuration, meaning water came in and out on the same horizontal plane. Most SVBs and other ones on the market are all an angle pattern, but the conbraco is a horizontal application, which gave it some interesting options for installations. Here's the cutaway of the SVB. Here's a side view of it, and here's the assembly top body, air inlet on the top, air inlet diaphragm, check assembly over here, comes out in one piece, replacing the whole check assemblies which is used for the average repair. Let's go ahead and take the 4W apart and see what it looks like inside. This is what the smaller, meaning 1/4 through 1/2 inch size looks like, and that's the one most people are familiar with. There is a single test cock as opposed to a PVB that has 2 test cocks. So single test cock and an air bleed, which is over here. Not an air bleed, but a vent bleed over here, which is the 2 parts of testing that particular type of backflow assembly. I have a much larger 1 inch, which I'm going to show you just so you can see it for visual purposes. It's a little easier to see. So once you take the canopy off the top, whether it's the small version or that, they're the same basic construction. Difference on the small one, meaning the 1/2 inch, was that I use a plastic body. Allen head screws on the cover for the body. Once I remove my screws, there'll be slight spring tension coming from the air inlet. Body comes off the top. Here is my air inlet spring. Here is my air inlet poppet. And there's my air inlet diaphragm, which sits just like this. Check assembly has a small retainer, and the check assembly comes out in one piece like this, sealed by an O-ring. This time we don't have those little knobs that have to turn into the body. So, check assembly mounts here, air inlet up here. The main difference between an SVB and a PVB is that the air inlet closes first and the check opens second. So that means the air inlet has to have a lower load than the check valve, which has to have a higher load, so that the air inlet will close first. And that's the main difference between those two. Reassembly is going to be just the reverse. New check assembly, mounting O-ring in place. So the check assembly pushes in here, allows the retainer to go on top like this. Air inlet. First thing we do is replace our diaphragm, our air inlet poppet, and our air inlet spring. Body back on top with our gasket to seal. Cover back on top. Screws. Not a hex or screwdriver, but a Allen head screw. Canopy. Again, the 4W500 series SVB from conbraco. The next series we're going to talk about is the 4D series in 100, meaning double check, 200 RP. Same things with the other models where the first 2 letters, the 40 or the 4S, in this case the 4D series. The numbers afterwards showing the type, 100 for double check, 200 for RP, 600 for DCDA, 700 for RPDA. The double check 4D-100 series looks like this. It was a 2-piece body, but what was unusual was that the end configurations did not have flanges but had the grooved ends like this, and the cover access from the top had a groove coupling. We're seeing that in more and more of the backflow assemblies today, where access to the covers, instead of it being a bolted on pattern, has that groove coupling similar to the one you see here in the picture. Here's a picture of those check assemblies as they're mounted in the body. Single access cover from the top is a groove coupling, as I mentioned, and then once you have the cover off with a ratchet or some kind of a wrench, you can remove the bolts. The check assemblies are bolted into the body, sealed by an O-ring. Check assembly comes out in one piece like this. For the average repair, you remove this assembly bolt in the center. That releases up the spring tension. It's unusual because it utilizes a 3-spring tri-mechanism on the outside and a 4th spring in the center. So actually 4 separate springs on the check assembly. The check assembly coming apart, as you can see here. Here's that tri-spring. Here's that assembly bolt. Here's the force spring which slides to the center, the O-ring, the check seat, disc retainer, disc, and disc holder. And that's the parts of the conbraco 4D100 series check assemblies. And the double check detector assembly is a 4D600 series, same number designation, same basic construction we saw here, utilizing the 4D100 series for the main valve with different spring loads, and utilizing the single check on the bypass. In other words, instead of it being a double check detector assembly, this is what's called a double check detector assembly type 2. Type 2 means that instead of the bypass having a small double check, the bypass only contains one check. So it is a main valve, similar as we've seen there, but you'll notice that the bypass only has a single check as opposed to a double check bypass, called a double check detector assembly type 2. So let's go ahead and see what the 4D series check assemblies look like.
Here's a picture of the conbraco 4D of a cutaway with the butterfly type shutoffs. You can see the relief valve mounts on the bottom. And here's that check assembly we're going to take apart in a minute, showing you that 3-spring mechanism on the back with the 4-spring mounted in the center stem, which we'll take apart in just a minute. You can see it's mounted to the check body by 4 bolts depending on the size, and the cover is the grooved coupling type cover, and the body is attached by a grooved coupling type cover also. Here's a little different picture of that check mechanism from the other side, showing you the check disc plate. Disassembling it is a matter of removing those 3 springs, which we'll do momentarily, taking the assembly bolt out, which allows the disc holder to come out in one piece. Here we can see the relief valve sensing line, is high sensing pressure line is attached here going to the relief valve body. So let's go ahead and take that check assembly apart.
Check is rather unique from the other designs that we've seen, and the 4D series check valve utilizes actually 4 springs. You can see 3 of them right here. There's a 4th spring in the very center, which I'll show you as I take this apart. So the check assembly has an O-ring that seals right here. It is bolted into the body like this, water coming in from your right, going through the assembly as it opens up through here. So to disassemble this check assembly, first thing we have to see is that there is an assembly screw right here in the center where the 3 springs come together. Using your Allen head recessed wrench, go ahead and unscrew it. That allows the bolt to come out in one piece. Once the bolt comes out in one piece, the springs will come off in a spring mechanism. In other words, the 3 springs are attached, riveted together like this. Now I can go ahead and pull the disc holder out from the back side, but you'll notice the stem protrudes through here. And on the RP versions, there's where that 4th spring sits, right inside there. So here's my check valve seat, checking that for any problems. Changing my disc is a matter of go ahead and removing my 3 little Allen head resets here, take off, put my new rubber disc back on place. Reassembling is going to be the reverse. Having my check assembly back in, backwards. Back in like this. My springs, 3 clips have to go underneath the little recesses like this. Go ahead and install my assembly bolt, having the springs in their slots just like this. Once I have those in place, go ahead and tighten down on that assembly bolt, just like that. And that's the check mechanism in the 4D series. Whether it's the 4D100, 200, 600, or 700, the check mechanism will be exactly the same. The RP series in the 4D family is the 4D-200 or the RP4-D. Production began around 2003. Fusion body is a ductile iron body fusion epoxy coated. Same check mechanism we saw in the 4D100 series. Here's an exploded view of the 4D200 series. Reduced pressure assembly. Check assemblies are modular construction bolted into the body. Single access cover, groove coupling on the top. Relief valve assembly mounted underneath, external relief valve sensing line, as you can see here. Check assembly utilizes that tri-spring on the outside with the 4th spring through the very center of the check assembly. Checks are very similar as we saw in the 4D 100 series. Obviously different spring loads in an RP on the 1st and 2nd check. But that same basic assembly bolt releases the tri-spring, the 4th spring which sits in the middle, mounting O-ring, seat, disc retainer, disc, and disc holder. The relief valve, which is mounted underneath the check assembly, again very similar to what we saw in the 4S200 series, which is exactly the same as what we saw in the 4D-200 series. Cover comes off, loose diaphragm, stem assembly comes out in one piece. That same O-ring stem design of the stationary guide, the stem with the O-ring in the middle, and the release seat which threads into the body. So this is the 4D 200 series RP, and in the RP detector assembly they make a 4D 700 series. Same 4D 200 series as the main valve with the bypass assembly. Again, it's an RP detector assembly type 2, and that means that the bypass has a single check. The bypass only goes around one check of the main valve. In other words, the DCDA and the RPDA Roman numeral 2, the bypass goes around the second check only, both on the double check version and the RP version. So you can see where the bypass is here, where it's after the first check body, and over here where it's after the second check. So all it is bypassing on the detector part is the second check of both the double check and the RP version. So it's a double check detector assembly type 2 on the 4D 600 and an RP detector assembly type 2 on the 4D 700 series. Let's go ahead and take it apart, see what it looks like. The relief valve will be similar to what we saw in the 4S series, that smaller size relief body. The 40 series had the very large body, but when the 4S series had the small relief valve body, and the 4D will utilize that similar small body. So that's our 4D series of family of conbraco backflow assemblies. The next assembly we want to discuss is the Craneline Model A. The Craneline Model A was a private label agreement that the Crane Company had with BAVCO. BAVCO produced the Model 6C, and Craneline got permission to sell that assembly with the Crane Mine designation on it. The Craneline Model A, or the BAVCO Model 6C, was produced in sizes 1 inch through 10 inch. We covered this when we did the BAVCO Hersey chapter from the Model 6C. So if you want to see the breakdown on that, go back to the BAVCO Hersey chapter. And that's our Craneline Model A.